The sky was wrong. People in Laurel County, Kentucky, had seen their share of storms, black skies, loud cracks of thunder rolling through the hollows, but nothing like this. At 3:17 p.m., the wind shifted. Dogs began to whine. Birds vanished into the trees and didn't return. And then the sky turned the color of gunmetal, bruised and churning, and the clouds folded in on themselves like fists. In the distance, sirens began to wail. At the edge of a church parking lot, lit by the last flicker of normal daylight, a battered white tour van stood idling, forgotten. Inside, Chris Brown sat on the vinyl bench seat, staring through the windshield like a man watching the world end. His phone buzzed in his lap, another alert, another warning, but he didn't check it. His eyes were on the sky. He'd been through turbulence before, literal and metaphorical, but nothing prepared him for the noise the wind began to make. It wasn't a whistle, it wasn't even a howl. It was a low, sucking roar, like the earth trying to breathe in all at once. He didn't plan to be in Kentucky. Hell, he wasn't even supposed to be on the ground. A missed flight out of Nashville, a diverted route, a busted alternator, whatever it was, he was here now. And within 5 minutes, that would be the most important mistake of his entire life. He opened the door. The air slapped him with force. Across the parking lot, a woman was struggling to herd 3 children out of a maroon minivan, trying to usher them into the stone church. One of them tripped, his sneakers caught in the gravel, and the woman dropped her purse, screamed his name, and lunged. Chris didn't think. He ran. The tornado wasn't visible yet, but everyone knew it was there. The clouds were spiraling faster now, forming a ring in the sky like a giant eye-opening. Emergency vehicles had peeled off down Route 80 half an hour earlier, heading toward a trailer park that was already gone now. Wiped off the map. Entire homes sucked into the air like paper. Chris scooped the kid up in one arm and motioned toward the woman. Get inside. Now. She looked up, her eyes wide. Recognition flickered there, somewhere between confusion and disbelief, but it didn't matter. She nodded. They ran together, shoes slipping on the pavement, as the first debris began to rain down around them. A roof shingle sliced through the air, missing Chris's ear by inches. Inside the church, it was chaos. Someone had dragged down mattresses from the upstairs nursery. 100 people were crammed into the fellowship hall, crouching along the walls, covering babies with jackets, whispering prayers. One teenage boy had blood running down his arm from a broken window, and someone was tying it off with a shoelace. The lights flickered, buzzing. The air was thick with sweat and fear. Chris set the kid down gently, hard hammering, and turned toward the windows. He could feel the pressure change. The building groaned, as if inhaling. Then, somewhere off to the west, the world began to scream. It started as a distant freight train, growing louder, deeper, meaner. Then a funnel touchdown. The tornado carved through Pulaski County like a reaper, 300 miles an hour at its core. Trees snapped like pencils. Trucks were hurled into the sky. It moved like a mindless god, unpredictable and furious, flattening barns, schools, an entire fire station. Reports would later confirm it hit EF5 intensity. It was one of the most violent storms the state had seen in 2 decades. And it was coming for them. People were praying now, out loud, in clusters. Chris stepped away from the window and found a closet near the front of the church that hadn't been opened yet. There were storage bins in it, blankets, old choir robes, and an emergency first aid kit so outdated it might have been from the 90s. But it was safer than nothing. He started clearing it out. He didn't want to be recognized, but it was already too late. A young girl with braided hair stared at him, her mouth slightly open. You're Chris Brown. He glanced at her, then at the others watching him now. Yeah, he said, with a dry edge. And right now, that doesn't mean anything. Help me clear this out. She nodded, grabbed one of the storage boxes and heaved it aside. Others followed. Fear moved fast, but sometimes bravery did too. Within minutes, they'd made space for 8 more people. He ushered in a pregnant woman, 2 elderly men with oxygen tanks, a mother nursing a baby, and the family he'd helped from the parking lot. He stayed near the door. Outside, the wind howled like something alive. The front windows exploded inward. Screams. Someone shouted for everyone to get down. Chris slammed the closet shut behind him and braced himself against it with his full weight. Then the tornado hit. It struck the church like a missile. The roof peeled back. Wood groaned, split, screamed. Glass shattered. A steel beam from a neighboring building slammed into the chapel wall and caved it in. Dust filled the air. Somewhere, water pipes burst, and a fire began to smolder. The world was shaking. People sobbed in the dark. But the closet held. For 35 minutes, Chris didn't move. The noise was unbearable, like God shredding the planet. He braced the door with his legs, teeth clenched, every muscle shaking. Behind him, the baby cried. The old man was whispering at him, voice cracking. He couldn't tell if it was the church that was shaking or just his body. He was soaked in sweat, dust stinging his eyes. But he held the door. When the tornado passed, it didn't leave silence. It left sobs, the hiss of broken pipes, the crackle of small fires. The building was half collapsed. Beams had fallen. The altar was gone. Chris kicked the door open with one foot and coughed, blinking through the haze. The people in the closet were alive. Somehow, they were alive. He stepped out into the wreckage like a man walking onto a battlefield. People were crawling, bleeding. Someone called out for help. A ceiling fan hung from a single wire, spinning uselessly. He didn't wait. He started pulling debris off a trapped man pinned beneath pews. 2 others joined him. They dug with their hands. The woman from the parking lot found him again. Her voice was hoarse. "You stayed," she said. He looked at her, blood trickling from his scalp, shirt torn, eyes wide with disbelief. "You needed someone." In the distance, the sound of approaching sirens returned. But for a lot of people in that church, the help had already come. And his name was Chris Brown. Smoke hung in the air like a ghost. The church was in ruins. Half the ceiling had collapsed inward, and daylight poured through the jagged hole above the pulpit, illuminating floating dust and twisted metal. The sanctuary was nearly unrecognizable. The stained glass windows, once vibrant depictions of saints and angels, were shattered, their fragments glittering across the floor like confetti from a funeral. Chris stepped over a broken pew, the floor groaning beneath his weight. His knees were trembling, though he didn't know if it was from exhaustion or adrenaline. Around him, people were moving like they'd just woken up inside a nightmare. A woman sat against the far wall, holding her toddler tight, rocking in slow, stunned silence. A teenager was digging through the rubble near the nursery, yelling a name, Caleb. Caleb, over and over. Another man, probably in his 70s, just stared at what used to be the roof, lips moving without sound. And through it all, Chris moved. He didn't have a plan. Didn't even know what he was doing half the time. But his body did. One step. One person. One beam lifted. One voice calmed. He'd tour-managed crews before, worked backstage with chaos breathing down his neck. But this was different. This wasn't ego. This was instinct. Outside, emergency sirens were growing louder, but the roads were choked with debris. Trees, cars, even entire porches blocked the way in. Fire trucks couldn't get through. Medics were stuck rerouting, inching forward from the east. So for now, they were on their own. Chris found a teenage boy trying to pull an older woman out from under a collapsed doorframe. Her leg was bent at a sick angle, and her foot was pinned. Chris dropped beside him without a word, planted his feet, and pushed. Together, they managed to lift the door just enough for her to be dragged clear. She screamed once, then passed out. "Lay her down on the coats," Chris told the boy. "Keep her warm. Don't move the leg again unless you have to." The boy blinked at him. You're Chris Brown." Chris looked him dead in the eye. "Today I'm nobody. Get her safe." He turned back toward the front doors, now half blown off their hinges. Outside, it looked like war. Trees stripped bare. Cars upside down. A gas station a block away was a skeleton, just twisted piping and fire. And then came the crying. Not inside. Outside. Chris froze. He stepped out, boots crunching on broken glass. He followed the sound, rounding the side of the church where a brick wall had collapsed outward. The crying was faint, high, breathless, desperate. And then he saw the hand. A small one. It was sticking out from under a plank of drywall near what had once been a shed. Chris dropped to his knees. "Hey, I got you, okay? Don't move." The child couldn't have been older than 6. She was trapped beneath 2 layers of insulation, wood and stone. Her face was covered in blood and dirt, but her eyes were open, blinking at him, terrified. He worked like a machine, hands tearing, lifting, dragging. Sweat poured down his face, stinging a cut on his temple. His palms were shredded, but he didn't stop. He got the last board off and pulled the girl free. She clung to him, sobbing into his shoulder. And still, no help. No fire department. No paramedics. Just sirens screaming from behind the chaos. He turned and carried her back through the broken doorway. Inside, people stared. Someone said, "That's the Mitchell girl. From Willow Bend." Another voice said, softer, they said that Trailer Park was leveled. Chris laid her beside her older brother, who had been pulled out earlier and was still unconscious but breathing. Then he sank against the wall and finally let himself exhale. Someone brought him water. Someone else patched his forehead with a strip of gauze. And for a minute, he just sat there, surrounded by strangers who looked at him like he was someone else entirely. A man in his 40s, tall, tired eyes, wearing a volunteer fire department jacket, walked over and crouched beside him. "I used to hate you," the man said. Chris didn't flinch. "You wouldn't be the first." The man shrugged. "Then today happened. You saved my wife and daughter." Chris didn't answer. The man nodded once and stood. "We need more people like you, whether we want to admit it or not." He walked off. Chris stared at the wreckage around him, the sound of distant engines slowly getting closer. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like running. To be continued. By the time the helicopters arrived, the sun was setting behind a blood-orange sky. It took 6 hours for the roads to be cleared enough for first responders to reach the church. 6 hours of digging, lifting, crying, and praying. 6 hours where no one was checking Twitter or Instagram or TMZ. No one cared about the man's past here, only the fact that he was still moving, still helping, while others sat crumpled and broken, waiting for someone to do what he was already doing. But now, the cameras had found him. The first drone buzzed overhead just as Chris was helping carry a woman with a broken pelvis onto a makeshift stretcher made from doors and an old tablecloth. He didn't even look up. But others did. Is that really Chris Brown? The Chris Brown. They were too exhausted to swarm him. But the whispers began, like wind before another storm. He felt the shift in the air, how it always began. Curiosity, awe, then scrutiny. He kept his eyes on the ground. On the next pair of hands that needed his. On the next kid who couldn't stop shaking. On the body they found beneath the collapsed bell tower. The paramedics finally pushed through around 10 p.m., armed with floodlights and triage kits. They started tagging people, green for stable, yellow for critical, red for immediate evacuation. The church turned shelter buzzed with urgent voices, walkie-talkies, generators. And somewhere in the middle of it, someone pulled out a phone. Flash. Another. And another. By midnight, there were already videos online. Chris Brown pulling kids from rubble. Chris Brown holding up a wall during tornado. Chris Brown, the hero of Laurel County? He saw the phones. He saw the faces. And still, he stayed. One of the medics, a short black woman in her 30s with kind eyes, approached him while he was wrapping a splint around a teenage boy's arm. "You've been up how long?" she asked, glancing at his blood-caked hands. He shrugged. "Since before the sky broke open." "You're bleeding," she said, pointing to the cut on his scalp, which had reopened. "You need stitches." "I'll wait." She gave him a long look. "You're doing more than some of our own today. Just don't disappear when the cameras leave." He didn't answer. Because deep down, he didn't know if he could promise that. He hadn't felt this raw in years, like his skin had been peeled back and someone finally saw what was underneath. Not the performer. Not the convict. Just a man. A broken one, trying to patch up something bigger than himself. That night, the survivors were bused to a nearby high school gym, where cots had been set up, soup heated on gas burners, and volunteers passed out water bottles and blankets. Chris sat on the bleachers, arms on his knees, head hanging low. Every muscle ached. His knuckles were split open. He hadn't eaten since breakfast in Nashville. But when the little girl he'd rescued from the rubble came to sit beside him, tiny fingers wrapping around his wrist, he smiled. Just a little. No words. Just presence. At 3:22 a.m., a local reporter approached with a handheld camera. Blonde hair in a ponytail, raincoat still damp, eyes rimmed red from hours of coverage. "Chris, I know you probably don't want to talk." "Then don't ask." She hesitated. "They're calling you a hero. Do you have anything to say to the people watching this? To your fans?" He stared at her. Then he looked past her, at the cots, the curled-up kids, the exhausted moms, the father kneeling beside his injured son, whispering lullabies through tears. "I don't care about fans right now," he said quietly. "Tell the people at home to donate. Blankets. Water. Time. Tell them that music doesn't matter if we can't even show up for each other when the sky tries to kill us." She blinked, then nodded, and walked away. But the clip would go viral. Within 12 hours, it would be played on CNN, The Tonight Show, and every local news station across Kentucky. People would say it was the most real they'd ever seen him. But for Chris, none of that mattered. Because at 6:14 a.m., while the storm sirens were finally going silent, a sheriff approached him with a folded piece of paper. "Call came through this morning," the sheriff said, voice low. "You're on a watch list." Chris blinked. "What kind of list?" "People to notify if found in a disaster zone. Apparently someone from your team's been trying to track you down for hours." Record label, lawyers, even your mother. Words out, man. Chris closed his eyes. The warmth of the moment vanished, replaced by a chill. You're gonna have company soon, the sheriff added. Paparazzi. Maybe cops. Maybe worse. What did I do? Chris asked softly, more to himself than anyone else. The sheriff looked him in the eye. You showed up. That's all. Then he walked off. Chris folded the paper, put it in his pocket, and turned back toward the gym floor. The storm was over. The sky was clearing, but the next one was already building. This time inside. To be continued. Morning broke over Kentucky like a bruise fading to yellow. Smoke still lingered in the distance, rising from downed power lines and gas leaks. The air smelled of rain, ash, and wet pine. It wasn't peace, but it was the closest thing they'd had in 48 hours. Chris stood outside the high school gym, hoodie pulled low, breath fogging in the early chill. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the little girl's hand reaching out from under that wall, or the blood pooling beneath the pew, or the way that man had looked at his wife like she was already gone. But the world was waking up, and it wanted answers. News vans lined the street like a convoy of vultures. Drones buzzed overhead. A team from Good Morning America had set up a camera crew just across the parking lot. The gym entrance was now flanked with deputies, not to keep people out, but to keep the press from shoving microphones into the faces of the grieving. And Chris? He was a headline now. The fallen star who stood up in a storm. Chris Brown, redemption in Kentucky. From courtrooms to church walls, is this who he really is? He didn't care. Or at least he told himself that. What he did care about was the quiet conversation he'd had with the sheriff an hour earlier. They want to send a jet for you, the sheriff had said. Your manager's got a PR team ready to flip this. Said you're back. Bigger than ever. Chris had just looked at him. Back to what? The sheriff had shrugged. That's not my business. But if you're asking me, maybe the thing you're running from ain't behind you anymore. Maybe it's ahead. Now, standing in the cold, Chris wasn't sure what that meant. All he knew was, people were starting to come up to him not for autographs, but for thanks. A mother hugged him like he was her own son. A young boy, bandaged and limping, gave him a drawing of the man who held the wall. A pastor handed him a Bible, inscribed on the inside, not perfect, just present. That one nearly broke him. He sat on the curb with the book in his hands, watching the media frenzy swirl beyond the tape line, and thought about everything he'd screwed up. Every time he'd let someone down. Every face he'd disappointed, including his own when he looked in the mirror. But here, in this place nobody planned to be, where everything had been stripped away, there were no bodyguards. No dancers. No stage. Just people. Just pain. And somehow healing. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. Chris. He looked up. A woman with silver-streaked hair and deep brown eyes stood there. His mother. Joyce. She'd flown in from Virginia the moment she'd heard he was missing. Her hands trembled when she reached for his face. You didn't call me, she whispered. I was busy holding up a church, he said. She choked on a laugh that turned into a sob, then pulled him into her arms. He let her hold him like she used to. Not as a man. Not as a celebrity. As her boy. Later, they sat on a bench behind the school. She held his hand. You know, she said, your whole life they've been waiting for you to rise or fall. But no one expected you to kneel next to strangers and bleed with them. He looked out across the yard, where volunteers were handing out meals, where children were laughing again, just faintly. I didn't plan to stay, he said. But you did. He nodded. Silence settled between them. Then she added softly, maybe now it's time to choose what staying really means. That evening, Chris held a microphone in his hands again, but it wasn't on a stage. It was in the middle of the gym, where the survivors had gathered for a memorial service. The lights were dimmed, candles lined the bleachers, and the names of the lost were read aloud. The town pastor invited him to say a few words. He hesitated, then stepped forward. Look, he said, voice scratchy, raw. I've been called a lot of things, and most of them I earned. I've messed up. I've hurt people. I've hurt myself. And for a long time, I thought that meant I didn't deserve anything good anymore. He looked at the crowd, but then the sky fell, and none of that mattered. No one asked who I was. They just needed help. And maybe that's who I really am. Not the guy who shows up for cameras, but the one who stays when they're gone. He paused. I don't know if this changes anything, but I know I'll never forget the people I met here. What they showed me. What they reminded me I could still be. He stepped back, eyes burning. The applause wasn't loud. It wasn't wild, but it was real. And that night, as the candles flickered and the wind blew gently through broken windows, Chris Brown sat quietly in the back row of a gym full of people who no longer saw him as a headline, but as one of them. He didn't have a comeback planned. No album drop. No press tour. Just a promise to return. And maybe, for the first time in his life. That was enough.